So welcome everyone to PoetryEast. I'm really excited. We're just setting up now for a full PoetryEast. It's almost sold out today. I'm going to be interviewing, in conversation really, with the Italian philosopher Federico Campagna. I was really struck by his work. I heard something he'd said and I immediately wanted to invite him. And this is kind of a teaser trailer almost for a whole year here at PoetryEast, where we're going to have PoetryEast on sabbatical for a year and do PhilosophyEast for a year. So you're going to really enjoy this conversation with Federico Campagna.
Thank you.
Welcome, Federico.
Thank you.
How are you doing?
Good. Excited to be here. Nervous to speak in front of a crowd from the London Buddhist Centre, I hope.
They're terrifying people, they heckle. I mean, in a nice way, but heckling.
I hope I won't fall into the mistake of over-intellectualizing things, which I know it's a great sin.
Yeah. Great sin, yeah. Anyway. So let's start. Let's get you settled. There's a chair there. Yeah. Let's just find you a place.
First of all, I wanted to thank you for inviting me here.
Oh, good.
Thank you very much. And thank you also to the team. I saw an amazing, immense team of people organizing the event.
Yeah, immense team, exactly.
Really immense.
Yeah, good. So I thought we'd start. With the day that you nearly died. That's what I thought we'd start.
Which one?
Which one? Okay. So in your first book, The Last Night, you very strikingly write about an experience that you'd just come to London, and you nearly died, or you thought you were nearly dying. So I thought we'd start with that and see where we go from there. Yeah,
well, I was with a friend, and at some point I thought I was having a heart attack. I was maybe 25, something like that. And so we called an ambulance, and I went to this place, and I didn't know what was going on. They just told me that I had to go into surgery very quickly. So I was on this wheelchair, and I went, of course, into the car park of the hospital to smoke a cigarette behind an ambulance.
Everyone's been there.
Yeah, they didn't tell me what I had. That's when they told me that my lungs had collapsed. And so, that was the first of a series.
What actually happened? Were you just like in the street?
Yeah, I was with a friend. It was my last day at work in a publishing house where I used to work. We were about to close the place with just the two of us, and then I was like, I think I'm maybe having a heart attack. Anyway, so I got into the surgical place, the operating table, and because I didn't know what that meant, and everybody seemed quite nervous, I thought I was going to die, or there was a high chance that I was going to die, and this feeling of anger overwhelmed me, which is strange. I was surprised, not my life flashed before my eyes, but I felt a feeling of anger for all the time that I wasted. Specifically at work. I mean, like all the time that I wasted working, but also the time that I wasted chasing things that at that moment were of no use at all to me. And then they sedated me.
Right, yeah.
And then I woke up and I didn't die, and so on. And then this thing happened again and again. And by the third time, it was really relaxed.
So it happened more than once.
Yeah. And then hopefully I've just had some lung surgery recently. Hopefully I fixed it. That's it. So I think this kind of, it's useful, as you know, in every tradition, the encounter with death or with the thought of death. Or visualizing it or experiencing or fearing it, I think is important because it puts things into perspective in many ways. In the simple way of saying time is limited, or at least lifetime on this earth is limited. On the other hand, because it gives you, I think, a perception or an immediate sense of the urgency of relating yourself with what is beyond a lifetime or what is around a lifetime, of understanding what a lifetime is, what you call life, and how easily you think it's everything. And then at some point, you are at the edge of this everything, and are you at the edge of nothing? And that's a big question, of course. And that's how it started.
So you didn't have a sort of, well, because often when people talk, I talked to quite a few people who either have near-death experiences or have had experiences like that. And so quite often they sort of see their life flash before them, or they see key moments. But the interesting thing about your experience is it seemed to be more a sense of anger, particularly about work. And
I come from a very political background. Communist through my parents, especially my father, and anarchist through personal inclination. And so I think I had this inclination also to identify society, as a place where much of our life is decided. Of course, the mistakes are always your own, and you are complicit in your own enslavement, if not the author of it, but somehow you're not the only agent in your own mistakes. Society itself pushes you, or encourages you, or lulls you into a series of mistakes. And at that time I was also, I would say, maybe 25 or something. I had this immediate feeling of, it's because of them, and then it's because of me. And I mixed it. So I wrote a book, for example, starting from that, which is a book against the religion of work.
Right, yeah.
It's a book on radical atheism, which is strange. I dedicated the rest of my life writing about religion. But it's a book for radical atheism towards certain beliefs, like the belief that work for work's sake is salvation.
And that comes out of that experience, do you think?
Yeah, directly.
Yeah. That there's this sense of just time wasted by working and hankering after things. Is that true as well?
The perception, the kind of ingrained idea that I had, that there was an innate meaning in things that you do following societal requirements, that somehow, work sets you free, as they say. There is of course, the whole thing can be rethought in an entirely different way. Work can be spiritualized and seen as an exercise, from sweeping a floor to planting an orchard. But in the way that I had been educated through my education in school and then in offices, there was an innate value in this idea of producing, of putting yourself into this machine, which I'd never really questioned until I realized that by falling into that, I was burning my life as a sacrificial offering to this unknown God. And I didn't want to do that.
No.
And then I continued to do that by necessity, but without but screaming my indignation to it nonetheless.
Because at that time, you're both your parents are professors and they're both communists, and you were an atheist at that time. Would that how you describe yourself?
Yeah, I was brought up as an atheist with anthropological inclinations. So looking at religions from an anthropological point of view, which I find very interesting, by the way. But yes, the bread and butter was atheism.
So how I understand it, where you went from there is this concept, but a sense that work is the new religion, and that our attitude to life. I think I see whether I might have got this wrong. Our attitude to life, our basic approach to life, whether we like it or not, is religious in a certain sense. It's interesting because I was thinking about David Foster Wallace saying in a very late talk he gave, saying something about if you don't worship something spiritual and religious, you'll worship your looks, or you'll worship money, or you'll worship status, or you'll worship work. So is that where you were going with that you've got that work had become a kind of salvation?
In a sense I was observing in terms of work, especially this idea of total dedication, of a complete abandoning yourself, a complete surrender, which in itself is a beautiful part of a religious spirit. In Arabic is Islam, literally. But I question the opportunity of dedicating yourself to that particular religion. Of course, religion always returns, especially if you try to destroy it. Jung, and then after Jung, Hillman was noticing how, was noticing how the gods have returned in the form of diseases, of illnesses. You know, that's a way of like showing the power of certain aspect of religion, which is divine possession. And then you have in political theology, for example, people like Carl Schmitt that notices how the origin of power, which is usually placed in the divinity, then returns in the 20th century through a totalitarian idea of the state, in which the leader is the sovereign. So it returns always, however you want to push it down. Because religion is the liminal science, is the science of the threshold, in a sense. The threshold between the known and the unknown, fundamentally. In a way, is a science of ignorance, of the limit of ignorance. You might contend that also philosophy is the science of ignorance. But philosophy is a science of ignorance that looks at the side that we know. And then acknowledges that there is an excess. Socrates used to do that, of course, you know, acknowledging that he was ignorant became the greatest philosopher, according to the oracle at Delphi, so according to a religious perspective. Religion looks the other way, into the other side.
I mean, the word religion means to bind, doesn't it? Something like that, to be bound by things.
Yeah, religion in Latin, yes, has to do with the putting together, the collecting, like you bind a book.
I see. Yeah.
But also and this aspect of making a community is typical of religion, as it is in Buddhism.
Yeah.
I must say actually that my knowledge of Buddhism is very limited. It's only theoretical. It's only most of what I know, I owe to the teachings of my friend Manlio. So I am twice removed. But yes, but I understand that the notion of community is important also in Buddhism. It's important also in Christianity, as is important in Judaism. The word synagogue, which is a Greek term, actually not Hebrew, is a Greek for assembly. It's a similar word as ecclesia in Greek, which is church. I think that's where different types of religions tend to split, or different attitudes to religion split. Religion is making an assembly, putting together things that are not naturally together. One way of seeing this assembly, this ecclesia, is an assembly of people. And you have a form of religion which is very much about community building in the sense of creating a political community, a state, a lobby and so on. Another type of community, another form of ecclesia, is making a community between people and, pass me the term, God, the gods, however you want to call it.
I see, yeah.
The elsewhere. Then it's a different type of combination. And that leads to another type of attitude, usually, which is more mystically inclined or more monastically inclined. Of course, it's still a community also of people, but not only of people. You see that often today, many ways of understanding religion go toward the first.
Yeah.
So there is a kind of combination between the political group, the religious group, and there's very little space for the other part.
So you had that experience, and it became about why am I working on it? The sense that I got was that you had a strong sense of injustice as a young man. You're fairly young now still, but you had a strong sense of injustice. And of course, when you had that strong sense of injustice, the instinct is to work for the good of all. That's so. How did your thinking start to grapple with what had happened to you and what you made of it? Because then you get to this thought about why are we in this position where work has become our God in a way, to put it that way.
Yeah.
Perhaps.
Well, I was influenced by some reading as well that I'd done. In particular, this philosopher called Max Stirner, who is a philosopher from the middle of the 19th century, German, an individualist anarchist. He had some problems with Marx, who wrote an entire book, The German Ideology, actually most of it, to denounce Stirner. He was a controversial character, died alone after being in jail for fraud. Terrible life. But he wrote one book, The Ego and Its Own, in which he talks about the way in which ideas function within our mind as ruling divinities, in a way that we elevate these ideas, these abstract concepts above our mind. For example, the concept of being a man, as in, for example, a male Being a male means to be this. And thus I shall obey that idea and behave like a male. Or being a man, or being an Italian, or being a worthy citizen, and so on and so forth. And he calls them the spooks.
The spooks.
The spooks. And he says, he preaches a form of atheism of the spooks. But then he goes one step further because he studied theology, actually interestingly, and he takes elements from a traditional theology called negative theology, in which God is seen as this completely ineffable abyss. And he says, I am that ineffable abyss. I have no name. I don't have an identity. I am the creative nothing out of which everything originates. That's how he says. And so he reconstructs philosophy and politics on this basis, in a very interesting way, by the way. And that was for me also the kind of starting point in dealing with these abstract notions, which were many. Work is one. Another one that struck me very much was the idea of nationality. I come from a family of migrants. They moved from the south of Italy to the north of Italy, which are one country, but very, very different in many ways. I moved from Milan to London, and my family has moved from Sicily everywhere, from the United States to everywhere else. And so this idea of migration was always with me, and this idea of nationality also, like, to what extent does it define somebody? Then you read the news and you see how many people are marked by their nationality in the name of a spook. Just south of where my parents are from, Sicily, we have thousands of people drowning every year. Just now there was another one because of that. And so I noticed that these spooks are not only reasons for me to waste my life, small problem, but also they are, ruling ideas that cause enormous crimes.
So let me just make sure I'm clear as well. So by spooks, they're like ruling ideas that sort of shape you, like I'm Italian or I'm this or other, which you end up kind of serving.
Yes, I used to call them in a book normative abstractions. That's kind of like philosophical jargon, but to be honest, it's just to say that they are abstract ideas and they are normative because they set the law and you obey the law. And the relationship you have with them is religious in the most detrimental sense of the word.
Which
is
questioning. In questioning, yes, okay, yeah. Okay, so I'm going to keep stopping and just making sure that I understand. So that takes you to this, then that takes me at least to your book, Technic and Magic, which is, you've got this, the book splits into two, it's got this like a mirror form of it, where the first half explores technic and the second half explores magic. And technic seems to be your way of zooming out from, I keep seeing you, in London as a 25-year-old, thinking that you're going to die, getting angry. I mean, I'm sorry to keep going back to that. I hope it's not a painful memory because I keep going on about it. And trying to make sense of that. Why was I serving those abstract normative goals, gods almost? And then you come upon this idea of technic. Can you sort of see if you can help us understand what you mean by that? There's a lot in that idea, and I don't know how many parts of it to bring in, but it's an important part of your thought.
Many ways. I think maybe let's try with this normative abstraction. I usually tackle it from another angle, but maybe I'll see if it works. So these particular gods, like the nation or work, and so many others. Everybody, I think, with their own particular deformity. Whether being a migrant or queerness or anything, like everybody has a way of rubbing against some of these things, and they are gods that set a law. Okay, so they're law-giving gods, but they're particular gods because they're not transcendent gods in a sense that they do not have a foot in the entirely unknown. They are completely included within the sphere of language. They are perfectly clear. Their law is literally to be followed literally. There is no possible interpretation. There is no ulterior meaning because there is nothing beyond them. They are constructions of language. In Technic and Magic, which was another book, the second book that you kindly mentioned, I started dividing the way of making world into Technic and Magic, kind of zooming into two different ways in which we can construct reality. We can go into why we construct reality. Although at the London Buddhist Center, I think that's totally unnecessary. And Technic, which is the way in which I kind of like summarized some of the metaphysical principles of the contemporary Western modern society, better westernized modern, because you find it in Tokyo as you find it in London, the center is language. Absolute language is how it's called in the book.
Yes, that's right.
I get a little better with the jargon every time. Hopefully in the next one it will be even more simple. Absolute language is a way of understanding a couple of principles about reality. The first one is that everything that exists can be grasped through linguistic means. So linguistic means the means of mathematics, the means of the catalog of molecular composition, of sexual preferences or nationalities, of consumer preferences, political, and so on and so forth. You know, all the different linguistic means which are included within technology. Our technologies are, for the most part, when they are about recognition, they're linguistically constructed. So that's the first belief. Everything that exists, at least potentially, can be grasped by a language. We just need to expand our technological means.
And are you saying, from this, taking up this metaphor of technique, that everything that exists is fully describable in language and can be, and it's like how it is. It's like this that you can describe it. Yeah.
This is part of the metaphysics that is implicit, for example, behind investments in big data. The idea of investing so much in creating the biggest possible accumulation of data around the world in order to foresee events and so forth is metaphysically rested on, at least implicitly, on this idea that all that there is can be captured by language. Otherwise it wouldn't make any sense to do this. Now, the second part of this thought, which follows from the first, is that what cannot be captured by language does not exist. Okay? What is not included within the grids of language does not exist. And you see that a lot of things, for example, in terms of sort of like forms of self-identity, but also psychopathologies, forms of different types of pain, different kinds of experiences of reality do not fall within language. They don't exist. With migration, you have a typical example, very basic. You lose your passport because your country implodes. You die before you die, in a bad way. You go extinct before you die. You disappear metaphysically. You're still there. But you can be allowed to physically die because metaphysically you have already disappeared. And then the last part of this, which follows from the second, is that fundamentally what really exists in reality is language. Reality is made of units of language. Reality is an enormous net of language. The things that activate these bits of language are like the current in a string of fairy lights. You are the activation of a series of linguistic elements. I am an activation of a series of linguistic elements. We exist as long as we activate them. When we stop activating them, we exist less and less and less until we happen to go extinct before we die. This is the basic of it.
Let me get this out. So how does that work internally? So you're sort of saying that, and I'm just trying to get my head around it. I think Buddhism is also interested in this. It's trying to say that experience cannot be contained by language, but language easily wants to contain everything, doesn't it? Even Buddhist language, it gets more and more technical, more and more sophisticated, and Buddhists fall out over different metaphors and so on. So you're saying that one way of configuring reality is that it's to do with a linguistic pattern, like a name I call myself, that I'm, in my case, I come from Henley Arden, I'm gay, I'm not Italian, I'm, etc., etc. And that's the sum total of me, as it were.
Yes, and the experience of it is that you have a clear sense that your existence is very conditional. It's conditional to your work. To the extent to which you participate to the different series of language, the series of nationality, the series of economic production, the series of expressing your preferences about anything and so on and so forth, that you have to participate to this in order to exist. If you drop out from these, you exist less and less. So you are in a state of constant blackmail of extinction, which is very strange. It's different from physical death. And so, this is the kind of experience that you have. And I think this goes together with some of the experiences that we witness also in contemporary society, which are silent forms of resistance to this. Panic, depression, typical ways of reacting to these emotions. They are also a form of rebellion to a certain extent. With depression in particular, you entirely you try to annihilate yourself in advance, in a way that you accomplish your worst fear. With panic, you have the sense of all the demands that come on you all at once, as they actually are, or anxiety is the same. And so, that's a kind of like emotional landscape.
And when you say total language, are you thinking, because it feels like language is getting more and more, but one of the things you say in your book is that you could then go from language to measurement. That because of language, everything then becomes more and more identified and measured and schematized. I've been struck, as I say, being gay, just how in my day I was just an old-fashioned gay. Now I can be anything on this incredibly nuanced landscape, but they're all very sectional. I can be gay, or I could be queer, or I could be this or that, almost what feels to me from my perspective sort of tiny adjustments, but they do seem to be getting tighter.
But I think that's I don't think there is a specific malignity or evil intention in the people that suggest the different identities, for example, in queerness or shades of queerness. I think there is an understanding that in order to exist, you need to do it.
Right, I see, yeah.
There is, of course, I think, a mistake, which is not
I was thinking
evil
that.
doing. It's a mistake in the sense that it's implicit in this the sense that it is inevitable that existence coincides with linguistic activations. Yeah, but it's not inevitable.
No, and that from this anything that exists has to exist in language, which of course something in us rebels against, doesn't it? And you're saying it can rebel in illness, in depression, anxiety. It can rebel, I think, in that sense. For me, it's that sense of this isn't good enough. This life that I'm given, these expectations that I'll do this kind of job, do this kind of, take part in these kind of social activities. It's just not good enough. For me, Buddhism starts with a kind of positive frustration with the world. Which you might say a positive frustration with absolute language, a positive frustration that the ways of describing being are inadequate. I don't know whether that sort of chimes with.
Yeah, absolutely. That's of course one way of challenging this. You can also challenge it logically, which is wonderful. Logic, especially in the 20th century, has tested some of its own limits, which is very interesting. And logically, you understand that language being a human artifact, which kind of coincides with the particular setup that humans have, in the way that the language of birds is a bird artifact that coincides with their own particular setup, then it will require an immense amount of faith to believe that for some miracle the universe is constructed to coincide perfectly with not only something as specific as the limits of a human mind, but the limits of a human mind as defined by the language of a particular society in a particular part of the world in a particular moment in history. This will require an immense amount of faith. And I think the typical thing is that the difference here with religion is that religion, to my understanding, is not to do with faith. the aim of religion is to know, not to believe. But the fake gods, they demand a different type of unquestioning obedience. Okay? And so I think logically you can challenge this idea of of a world that's constructed through absolute language by seeing that it is very implausible. That's another way of rebelling to it.
And that's going to take, I don't know whether we'll do this now, but that's going to take us to the great question of death, isn't it? Because in a certain sense, we started with you feeling that you were about to die. All the things that you could say about yourself, you're Italian, anarchist, communist parents, living in London, all of that was going, or looked like it was going, and then would you be left with nothing?
Oh, that's the question, exactly. Yeah. But that's another thing. I mean, an interesting exercise to, starting from the assumption, which I repeat just for emphasis and clarity, that the way in which we perceive reality is the way in which we perceive it as filtered through our cognitive and sensorial limitations. Then it's further reconstructed within our mind on the basis of the shape of the language that we speak, that we think, and then on some prejudices that depend on the particular culture or society where we live. And this is the room that you're seeing around you. Okay, the room that you're seeing around you is the product of this process. So you can see that the room that you're seeing in this moment around you has a very, very faint resemblance with what is actually happening around you right now, if at all. But let's say a faint resemblance.
Talk us through that. Why is that? Just I might be slower.
Okay. I don't want to repeat obvious things, of course, for a Buddhist audience, but of course, the room that you're seeing around you right now, as you know, it's taking place within your awareness, not outside of your awareness. You don't have a kind of relationship with an outside, so to say. It is an inner theater. This inner theater is defined by your experience of something. Let's just remain vague what that is. And this experience of that something is processed through a series of things which have to do with your bodily setup, with your moods, with various things, with your physical illnesses, with your cognitive setup. And then this jumble of perceptions is then systematized, because you have to understand, of course, in order to traverse this room, that there is such a thing as space. Unfortunately, space does not exist. Neither does time. These are ways that you use to systematize. And these depend on some personal preferences, some beliefs, how you were instructed by your society. And in fact, different people in different moments in history have done this operation very differently, including space and time. And so they have physically different experiences of the same room. If you walk with a 5-year-old child in the same room, you realize very quickly that you are experiencing two different material worlds. That you are metaphysically disaligned. It's not that they are stupid and you're clever, you're seeing the things. It's that the same thing manifests itself through this process as two different worlds.
Let's just home in on that for a minute, because I was very struck by that a child's world, because the instinct is to think the child's world is a less mature version of yours,
of course,
and that you're constantly having to sort of correct them. But when you're with a child, and I've been, children in my own life, they created they're in another world, aren't they? And you have to find some way of bridging these two worlds, your adult world and their world.
And that's exactly what they think of you.
Right. Yeah.
That's the wonderful thing. I mean, when they take a banknote out of your pocket and rip it and paint on it, they are amazed by how attached you are to that thing. Obviously that's a piece of paper, but in your world, it's not.
Right,
in your world, that thing is £5. Now that's a crazy belief to have. No? Yeah. I mean, the possibility of monsters under the bed is more believable. There is a metaphysical disalignment.
You've got a son, haven't you? Your son's 10, isn't it?
Yeah.
Arthur, I think, isn't it?
Yes.
Yeah. So did you? Is that coming out of your experience of being with Arthur?
Yeah, many things are out of my experience of being with Arthur. And if through the time and the book that I'm writing now, my storytelling has improved a bit, it's because of his training. So I owe him a lot of ideas, including this. Including this.
I was struck one of my partner's daughter when she was tiny. I turned the light off, and she said, "Leave the light on because I see monsters." And I was really struck that she just said, "I see monsters," not "it's as if I see monsters," or "in the dark it kind of feels thing." It's just like a statement of fact. I see monsters in the dark, so put the light on.
Mm-hmm.
And you can just about have a sense of that world, can't you, as an adult? Can you or can't you? Is it closed to us now?
To a certain extent. I mean, it's very difficult to inhabit somebody else's world.
Yeah.
In a way, the function of a society is precisely as a metronome, like the ticking thing for piano, no? That gives a regular sound, a regular rhythm, so that you can do your worlding and me on the same rhythm. So that when we say, let's meet at 4:30 here and we pay £5, then we understand each other.
Right, yeah.
But in fact, we're not spontaneously making the world similarly simply because we have the same age or we're born in the same place. It's just that society works as this kind of like synchronization machine.
Yeah.
But to return a moment to the problem of death and how that's a good exercise, I think, for this.
Perhaps even back to this room and how we're creating our experience. But let's go to death first.
But that's an interesting concept, I think, because if you stop for a moment to consider what death is an idea that we have, and it's the name and the concept that we associate with an experience, not of the people dying, of the people around them, of the living. So death is an idea of the living, not of the dead, which is already interesting. And they witness that to the range of what they can observe of another person, what they can measure in various different ways. Of course, maybe the next night they will dream about them, but that doesn't count, okay? Not in this metaphysical perspective, not in the metaphysical perspective that we have at the moment. That's not real. But I can measure your pulse and then you fall out of the range of the observable. Okay, that's a very limited definition of what death is. Now, we take this as a real event. On top of that, we associate it with another idea that after this there is absolute nothingness. So the disintegration of something into nothing. It's not a transformation in a way, but the disintegration of that spark, of that thing into nothingness. Also, the idea of nothing is very interesting because it's an entirely negative human idea. In Buddhism, of course, there is an enormous discussion over the nature of nothingness and the void. But the way in which, in common sense, we understand nothingness is as this, I don't know how to describe it, as the absence of everything. So when existence is smothered and dies. But that's also has some logical problems. Of course, we could have a very doctrinal discussion about specifically this point. But I find that there are some logical problems with the thinking of nothingness as opposed to somethingness. Either there was never something, or there is never nothing. The two things tend to not go together.
You'll have to talk me through that one.
Existence itself, the fact of things being there, the fact of this glass being here, of this moment in time being here, the fact that this moment is enlivened and endowed with the quality of existence. The quality of existence is a quality that transcends language. In fact, in philosophy, it's the vanishing point of thought. There are two vanishing points of thought in philosophy: awareness and existence, which you could say also in Hindu theology, the Atman and the Brahman. Which, in fact, according to the Advaita Vedanta school, they are the same. Now, awareness and existence are vanishing points because they are the ground that sustains the very possibility of thought. Now, all the things that we create through thought, including space and time, presence, and so on, come next. These things come before. And coming before, they're not subjected to the rules of language. The rules of language, for example, understand separation or understand contradiction, understand time, something being there and not being there anymore, change. Existence and awareness come before these rules, and they're not subject to them. So for something to exist, because things exist, their very existence cannot be limited two temporal dimensions.
I see,
It's eternal.
Yeah, yeah.
Fundamentally. Existence is an eternal attribute. You can call it void, or you can call it God. However you call it, the fact, in the Bible God says, I am that I am, you know, which is interesting. It's just a double use of the word to exist. It doesn't go together with the idea of nothingness, because nothingness is a negative concept, derivative in language. Anyway, but let's not get too bogged down.
Yes, let's keep going back to this moment. In my mind, I'm at this moment of death, as it were, and you're saying it's an experience for others. Slightly like Wittgenstein, isn't it, saying that death is not an event in life, which I've always thought was a bit too clever of him. I mean, he was a very clever chap. It's a bit too clever. But what you're seeming to be saying is that all the measurables go, but then what we can measure and know by language is incredibly limited, almost absurdly limited, endlessly limited almost, that we can't possibly capture even a glass in language.
Exactly.
Or measure its qualities exhaustively in language, never mind a person that we've loved or known, you know. So that our machinery that we now take to be reality, that we talk about things, know things, use language, measure things, categorize things, just simply cannot, is not appropriate to this experience, whatever it is. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, every single object, if considered in its being and as participating to reality as a whole, exceeds the realm of what can be said about it. In part because there are some aporias within language. Every linguistic and logical system has to found itself on some principles that come prior, that cannot be demonstrated by the principle itself. Anyway, these are some details. But also because, once again, it is a matter of deciding whether or not to put your faith, blind and questioning faith, in the possibility, existent but very remote, that the limits of language are not only the limits of my world, as Wittgenstein cleverly said, but they're the limits of reality, since eternity. Possible, very unlikely. So the existence of this glass is just, for me, the thing that it appears to me, this glass as I see it and so on and so forth, has a very faint resemblance with what it is. This is also in Kant and in phenomenology afterwards.
Yeah, cool.
But usually in 20th century philosophy, we tend to, and 19th century philosophy in particular, we tend to forget the fact that, for example, in Kant there is the phenomenon and the noumenon. So there is the part that appears to you as it appears to you, the phenomenon, and then there is the other part, which is never discussed. And fine not discussing it, but not fine not forgetting it. And so when we're talking about death, death is an event that happens to the observable of a fragment of reality. Like your life, to me, is an event that happens. To me, you are a fragment of what you are. And I cannot say, that I have an understanding of your being there. Maybe neither can you. And so the belief, for example, in death, as we conceptualize it, very shaky. Okay? It's a very implausible notion. It's a useful fiction. And that's where we're going to go probably. It's like we live through fictions, which is fine, but let's be careful how much we want to believe them.
So what we're going to do is we're going to break for a cup of tea in a moment, and we'll come back to useful fictions, I think, and I've got a few other thoughts. But I'm also struck, just as a little side point there, that I'm struck by it because, I've still got my mother's death in mind. She died last year, and, I keep sort of experiencing her, as it were, particularly in meditation, but also, I've been dreaming about her a lot and so on. And yes, our tendency is to dismiss those things as, for psychological reasons, well, you're doing that because, you miss your, I've never thought that really describes the experience. I remember not long after my father died, I came back like 5 days later and opened the front door, and it was so vividly like he was sitting watching the television, as he always did. It didn't feel like a psychological need. I didn't feel gravely disturbed by his death, because his death should have happened as it was. It wasn't a mistake or anything. But So I'm interested that that thought you had there, just as a side. But we have dreams about the dead, but that we don't count that. Why don't we count that?
Because we have particular. I mean, in order to make that machine work that creates the world, we need to have parameters, and that's an unfortunate condition. And these parameters are always excluding something. There is always an excess that has to be excluded. This is just how the machine of our mind works. When we fictionalize things, and so we have to cut some things out on the basis of mostly 19th century ideas about materialism. We are inclined to believe that usually for something to exist it has to have a material dimension. In fact, we look for dreams through neuroscience mostly. And so to the extent to which it doesn't exist. Nowadays materialism is changing, so maybe 100 years from now there will be a different metaphysical belief that includes dreams more than today. But I wanted just to say one thing before we break. I am very skeptical about the reality of death in terms of it being something more than a particular concept. But I'm not skeptical about the reality of grief. The experience of grief is a different thing. The experience of grief is an actual experience that you have, which is based on also a series of beliefs. For example, usually is proportionally related to the extent to which you believe in death. The tendencies that not necessarily you might miss somebody simply because you miss them. Grief is real. Death, I'm not so sure.
Well, that's a great place to have a cup of tea, isn't it? And then we'll come back and we'll carry on our conversation. But let's have a cup of tea first. Let's carry on. It's all been perfectly straightforward so far. Yes. There's this horrible sense of being on the edge of the abyss. Anyway, so just to go back to this idea again, which I got wrong at the start, which is that we leave the world through wisdom. So we leave in Buddhism, wisdom is beyond words. In fact, Bhante Sangharakshita, the founder of the order and movement I belong to, wrote a book called Wisdom Beyond Words. It's beyond wisdom. Prajna in the Sanskrit word is beyond words, beyond all conceptions, beyond time and space, beyond the bifurcation that we create in the world between subject and object. So one of the things, how I understand your thought, is that part of what we're enmeshed in is this absolute language, which keeps us limited to what it will allow, if you see what I mean. You can say whether that's right in a minute. But what you then do is and in a way it's quite a good place to have that tea break, because then you move into this another way of looking at the world, which is magic. And you don't mean magicians' actions, and you don't mean circuses. You mean something very particular by magic, and you talk about the ineffable, which of course for any Buddhist practitioner is an essential matter. Of course, as soon as you talk about it, you're then collapsing it back into language, and so you get all these things in Buddhism which is trying to get out of language.
It's a myth.
It's a myth, yeah.
In the best sense of the word.
Yeah. So why don't we start with that? Why do we start with that? So is my recapitulation, does that chime with your thought that whatever wisdom is, prajna, is beyond words, is beyond language, is beyond time and space, is beyond...
Yeah. So absolute language, as I was describing earlier, I describe as the metaphysical foundation of common sense for most of us today. To function our society is based on this common sense. Of course, if you go and interview high-level scientists, they would certainly question it. Right. But in our daily life, there is a common sense metaphysics that we share at your workplace, at the border control and so on, and that's called absolute language. Okay?
Including like what time it started tonight.
Including that. Yes, of course.
Yeah.
Now, what I question about this is just in part the consequences that it has existentially, and in part the decision to completely shield an aspect of reality off, and to have this incredible faith in our own ability through our limited cognitive means to grasp the whole of reality. I think this is very implausible. On top of that, it has tremendous consequences. Now, of course, I don't want to suggest as an opposite to this to necessarily embrace the mystical way. Okay, that's not the necessary alternative. The way of entire fana, as it's called in Sufism, annihilation, is possible. It requires a certain physique that I don't have, for example. I think most of us don't have. We have to work through language. We are bound to language. We have to, in a way, in order to exist in a world. The world is precisely the effect of this linguistic machine. We have to create linguistic distinctions. I need to believe that I and this clothes are two different entities. Right. Otherwise, I would have real difficulties putting them on. In case of schizophrenia, you have this erasure. Philosophically, there are moments of sanity, not insanity. But the problem is that socially, there are moments of insanity because then you do not function anymore. Now, the problem is to what extent we decide to believe in these fictions. So fictions that we need, but to what extent we want to turn them into spooks, like using Max Stirner's idea. Magic is the word that I use to describe a different system of reality based on different principles from absolute language. First of all, it's not about magic. Of course, why did I use the word magic if it's not about magic? Because it was a mistake, okay? It was a mistake. It was a lucky coincidence because marketing-wise, it works a charm. But conceptually, it's a disaster. In the book, I explain why I use the word magic. Because the word magic comes from the Greek, magike tekne. You probably remember from your history lessons that the Greeks had one enemy, fundamentally, the Persians, always. The Persians were the nemesis of the Greeks. The barbarians were, but the Persians were the opposite. They were slave to the king, everything about them was the opposite of the Greeks. The essence of the Persians was the art of their priests, the Magi. The art of the priest is the magike, Magi tekne art. So it is by definition the way of the other. To us, that's the other. So writing from the world of Technic, I was defining the alternative as magic.
I see. Yeah.
Okay. Now I see now that it is not strong enough a reason to choose the word.
Also, my history lessons didn't include whatever. I think I did something about George II, and I can't remember anything about it. So anyway, you're much better educated.
Anyway, so that's why any magic is just the way of recreating reality without the forgetfulness of the unknowable. Sounds a bit of a mouthful, but without acknowledging what's beyond the limitations of your mind, even though you don't try to include it. There's a beautiful expression used by a German-Italian philosopher of the 15th century, as in German by birth, but mostly Italian by influence, called Nicolas of Cusa, and in a book called Deducta Ignorantia, of learned ignorance. He describes how you have to relate with science. And he says you have to relate with science using logic and language to the extent to which it goes, and after that stopping with language, but not stopping. You do the second part with something else. And I think this is a very important piece of advice. First of all, this is the kind of thinking that kick-started the Italian Renaissance. Right, so in terms of what it produces, good stuff. But also, it's a bit like the problem of reality. It's like trying to tackle a very complicated meal with many different courses. If you try to use only a fork, you're going to miss out. You need a kit of things, a fork, a spoon, a knife. You cannot tackle the meal of being alive in the world only through language. And I contend also not only through mysticism. Reality is very variegated. Language is not false. It taps onto something, but a fragment. You need other tools in your arsenal. And that's magic in a way. That's the idea before magic, and then I try to construct this different reality system.
So we'll come to that the reality system. But so what? There's because we do need. I think it's very important that you're right to say that we do need language. We do need commonly accepted sort of norms like time and like space and like if you say you're going to come at 7, you come around 7, and the events and so on.
Or like death.
Yeah, but where does it become a problem practically? Where does technique? Because you could say, well, we can work like that. We can sort of have a sort of consensual reality that's sensible enough and useful. But where does it seems to me to become a problem, and you seem to be. Are you saying it's a problem?
Well, yeah, I was saying earlier that it is a problem because it brings about a certain number of consequences. To a certain extent, every form of worlding is legitimate. It is legitimate. I'm not saying that magic is more true. It is wider, so certainly it includes more. It's less fundamentalist in a sense. But the real way in which I think it's possible to decide between different metaphysics to embrace, it's on the basis of the consequences that they bring about. The world of technique creates an existential experience for the individual that is unbearable, I find. On top of that, it creates consequences also for the other people that I believe are unacceptable. It's on that basis that you can exterminate an entire race because you believe there are races. Race is a linguistic construct.
Yeah.
I mean,
so let's go one by one. So let's start with why is it unbearable, first of all, personally, and then let's go a bit more to this.
It's unbearable personally because you always feel exactly in this mill of work that was defining earlier, in a way like you constantly try your best to activate as many linguistic positions, as luminously as possible all the time. And they keep going off. You need to constantly redo it. That's the typical demand of the desire of a machine, to say, is to be constantly activated. And the linguistic machine has this kind of desire. If you use the linguistic machine as a criterion to define what exists and what doesn't exist, okay, so you have to feed it all the time. And you see that you slip constantly. On top of that, you have next to you, one step away from you, the abyss of annihilation. You can be nullified, physically alive, awareness still on. You're still there, but you're not there anymore. That's even worse than dying, in a sense. It's literally the opposite of death.
I don't get that yet. So what do you mean by annihilation then?
If you drop
Can you give an example of that?
Yeah, if you drop out of too many linguistic series, you exist less and less and less. To the extent to which if you embrace absolute language as your way of creating reality, you don't even recognize yourself in the mirror anymore as existing. You see yourself as a ghost, which technically you are. A ghost endowed with a physical presence. And yeah, so I mean, this is the kind of motivational, emotional background that then makes you behave in a certain way, frantically living with this constant fear of the annihilation one step away from you, and also the belief that the moment all your lights will be off, including that of material detection, then you will be entirely annihilated.
I see.
I think it's very difficult to live like this.
So it's like that you live only to the degree that you can sort of be understandable through language, and at some point, you're literally not going to be. You're not going to have a pulse. You're not going to. You're not going to be observable. So you'll be nothing. Is that what?
Yeah, but nothing as the turning off of a light.
So, and then the effect on others.
The effect on others, the history of the 20th century.
Right. I think. Is by creating nation states.
For example.
Yeah. By
creating nation states, by deciding that if I have to choose between £1 million and you, obviously I choose £1 million because they are more real than you.
Right. Yeah.
Metaphysically speaking, the potential of activation that there is in £1 million is certainly greater than there is in a human being, unless the human being is the owner of £10 billion, okay, and so on and so forth. I mean, it leads to a particular way of what it's called, for example, as financialization. It's a political event, but all the political events derive from metaphysical decisions.
Yeah.
Politics is the art of managing the possible. Metaphysics is the art of defining the possible.
Yes.
And so this is, I think, very important.
Yeah. So say more, because you're talking about something pre-political, aren't you?
Yes.
That out of which you create a politics.
Yes. Politics defines the range of possible moves on the chessboard. Drawing the chessboard and defining the qualities of each of the pieces implies all the possible politics that can derive.
Yeah.
In a way, I think there is a feeling of being stuck in the current historical moment, also because we seem to be stuck in a particular metaphysical perspective of the reality. If we consider reality as we do today, the range of the possible is predefined.
Yeah.
And we find it increasingly unacceptable, the range of that possible. But we can't get out. It is impossible to achieve real change politically, because you need to achieve it metaphysically first. You need to question a number of things. The existence of abstract notions, for example, as spooks in the sterner sense. Then this is a pre-political work that changes the field of the possible politically. Yeah.
I really like that idea, because I'm a bit fed up with politics. I'm sure lots of people are, but if you're not careful, everything gets reduced to political discussion. And I think there is something underneath that, like how you create a world in which certain moves become possible. So let's then go on to, if you can, about what's the world that magic creates, to use that word, that this other, this ineffable, this not able to be contained by language. I'm losing my plot of plot.
Well, it's simply the awareness of your ignorance. It's simply that. The awareness that whenever you are faced with an idea or with a physical experience or with an image, there is no lack of reality to this image to a certain extent. I mean, as an experience is real, absolutely. But there is more to what you can see, to the extent to which most of what there is to this cup I cannot see. Most of what there is. The distinctions that I draw in the world are fictional, because the world itself in its being is not reduced to the seams that exist to a certain extent between the different parts of the same limb. Time itself is similar to a line drawn on an arm, If the year 0, 1000, 2000, which one comes before the other? They all come at the same moment, but the experience of it is sequential. You see what I mean? You start understanding, relativizing linguistic notions. You don't abandon them, but you relativize them.
In the sense that you don't commit to them so much, you don't believe in them so dogmatically or unthinkingly.
Absolutely.
That might be another way.
And you realize that they are useful, however. They're useful because they allow you to function in a society and to enjoy some sort of nice things. Meeting a friend at a particular moment in the afternoon. And you acknowledge that it is impossible for you to have a world without them. And you also notice that some words, there is a certain way of relating with a word, with language, that also opens up the bridge into the ineffable. Ineffable means simply what cannot be said. What cannot be said cannot be expressed, cannot be defined or described, but it can be hinted at. The hinting at things is usually what symbols do. A symbol is a hinting at the thing. I imagine also, in all religious traditions there is plentiful use of symbols.
Yes, that's right.
And there's also always the risk of idolatry, which is mixing the symbol for the thing, the literalist understanding. Idolatry is absolute language. Okay,
it's interesting because as you're talking, I'm thinking, the Buddha could use language, would be able to think, would be able to discuss things with people, would be able to disagree. He saw through egotism. He no longer had an ego, but didn't mean he just walked into trees and things like that, because he didn't think he existed in that literal sense. But traditionally, he always knew he was using language. He didn't mix up language with experience and reality. It was an acceptable way of trying to communicate something that goes beyond that.
And that's, I know, something that you are working on also yourself. That's also one of the ways of approaching mythology.
Right, yeah. So let's talk about myth, because I think that's very important.
You want to start?
No, you.
You're also working on this.
Yeah, but you've written 2 books. I'm just starting trying to write one. So I'll go there.
Well, mythology is very interesting. It's a very interesting form of literature, form of using language. I think the best book, in a way, the best introduction to mythology that I've ever read is a book by a writer from the 5th century, from the area of Rome, called Saturninus Secundus Salutius. And the book is called On the Gods and the World. On the Gods and the World is a book written by a late pagan just at the time when Christianity has become state religion. Just at the time it has become state religion again. It was state religion, then there was an emperor called Julian, the apostate, who dropped it, hired Salutius as his minister of culture, started changing everything, went into battle, died. Lasted 2 years. And then Christianity was imposed again. Salutius writes this book after this happens. It's like a message in a bottle, basically, to explain to the future what paganism was. He was a neo-pagan, and so he has a very similar understanding to many religious traditions that we have afterwards. Neoplatonism is a form of negative theology and so on. In this book, he begins by tackling myths, and he says, the Christians laugh at us because we have myths, and they say these myths are full of immoral stuff. So, very well, but because they don't understand how to read them. Okay? The point here is that a myth is a way of talking through language about something that is outside of language. It's a way of narrativizing in time something that exists eternally. It says literally, because the facts of myth never actually happened, but are always. Sounds almost like Jung in a way of talking about yes. And he says also literally, because the world itself is a myth, where bodies are visible and souls are hidden. And it turns completely the table. He says a myth is a form of expression where you have a physical appearance that hints to an invisible essence, and this essence is the point. He says, isn't the world a myth? Beautiful, no?
Very beautiful, yeah.
Yeah, it was very good. And so, yeah, mythology I see in a similar way. They are linguistic means to point to something. Of course, they don't mechanically work. That's the problem with myths. I mean, myths, we can talk about them for hours. But one of the problems of mythology, which today leaves us a bit frustrated, is that in a novel, things mechanically work. I describe an erotic scene in a particular way, you get what I'm talking about. In a myth, you don't necessarily get what they're pointing at. Also because imagine if I'm pointing at a star in the sky, there's many stars around them. You know, which one? Depends. I mean, depends how you relate to them. And it very much depends also to what extent you try to inhabit them. They offer existential positions. Once you become the trickster, you see what the figure of the trickster is and how it thinks. Dionysian possession, psychopathology and so on. But then if you inhabit it, then you see what it means. Okay? So it's a very complicated form of literature, but I think it's fundamental.
So myths always need reading, don't they? So what we're moving towards there is this whole other way of using language. Poetry is one of them. You know, poetry is using words to try and get beyond words. That's what it's always meant to be doing. That's why it's so impossible to actually do. I mean, there's lots of people who write poetry, but actually pulling one off is next to impossible. So it's using words to try and get beyond words. The symbol is similarly doing. It's something a symbol appears in the subject-object dichotomy, but it's pointing beyond it. The myth, similarly, is like parables. I'm particularly struck by parables that they, like the parables that I know from Buddhism, particularly. I've been thinking about the parables from the White Lotus Sutra, Chinese sutra, just endlessly suggestive of something beyond language. And when you read them, they feel much more, in some senses, much more suggestive than doctrine, but that also makes them blurry. You know, you need to understand, you need to read them.
Yeah, I mean, they cannot be captured and closed in a particular way. Also, they have some particular characteristics. For example, myths tend to be contradictory. There is there isn't a kind of tight conceptual frame within them. That's also why they can include aspects of immorality, so to say, in order to set moral lessons, which is very odd. They have a poetic form, and for a very long time, theology, mythology, and poetry were one and the same, and religious writing and philosophy also. Heraclitus writes through poems, and the Iliad, and the Iliad in particular, more than the Odyssey, is a religious text, which is something we always forget.
Yeah, it is. Yeah.
But it is a religious text, and it is a poem, and it is a myth. And to a certain extent, also the Gospels can be seen as a product of the Greek mythological tradition, the parable, and so on and so forth. Now, the myths are, to a certain extent, they have disappeared greatly because much of the way we use language in an absolute sense cannot hint at something beyond it. So by necessity, this form of hinting at has disappeared. You find it sometimes in forms of literature. Maybe literature has the inheritor of mythology, to a certain extent.
But also you need a certain sensibility to get the hint. Oh, in Buddhism, one of the great issues, in life I think one of the great issues is literalism. That you can't get the hint. You can't see that language is trying to suggest something. So you want to literalize it. And you could think of two kinds of literalism. One is where you have a dismissive literalism, where you dismiss anything that doesn't fit your total language. Or you have a credulous literalism, where you, want to believe that in hack cures or terrible things have happened because of credulous literalism, where people have thought that women are witches, for instance, is an example of credulous literalism. So you need a certain sensibility, don't you, to get the hint. How do you get that sensibility?
That sensibility really has to be grounded on my belief is that everything fundamentally descends, almost everything except one thing, descends from your metaphysical decisions. If you do not include within your understanding of reality the fact that there is something beyond the realm of the knowable, conversely, if you believe that the realm of the knowable includes, or the potentially knowable includes everything that there is, that's it, then it's impossible to get a hint.
Yeah, that's right.
It's impossible. You will always have a literalist understanding. But that's also why, for example, in mystical Islamic literature, you have one of the greatest masters, Ibn Arabi, one of the greatest European philosophers, because he was Spanish, although it's never in the books of European philosophy, because he was Muslim. And he writes that the name Allah as well is a myth. That Allah is not God. Because Allah is a conceptual linguistic definition of the Godhead. But the Godhead, of course, does not coincide with that. Very interesting. Of course, you can imagine this in a particular religious milieu being met with hostility. But literalism is a grave danger. And the total abandonment of language is also a danger.
Yes, yeah.
In a way. That's usually a danger for yourself.
Yeah.
Literalism is a danger for yourself and others. So if you have to choose between the two mistakes, I think go for the mystical way. But
what's striking, what you're saying there, is this thing that everything descends from a metaphysics. In Buddhism has this idea of a view, which is drishti, which really means a kind of it's very much like what you're saying about myth. It's how your patterning view of seeing things, that they exist separately to each other and so forth. It's the metaphysics. It's in your terms, sort of the metaphysics in which you understand your experience.
Yeah, because you experience, you rarely experience your experience directly, even though the point of meditation is to get as direct as possible.
Yeah.
But rarely you do.
Yes, that's
Usually
right,
you experience your experience through a filter.
Yeah.
A filter of sense, a filter of recognition, which is in fact recognition. You cognize it and then you recognize it. The second filter is metaphysics, usually. And then it's on the basis not of what you have cognized, but what you have recognized, then you create the world. And everything else. You read a poem, you interpret somebody's presence. So that's why I think metaphysics is being the filter, the decision about how reality is structured, predefines everything else. Unfortunately, this filter cannot be grounded on anything. This is the problem. Metaphysics is ungrounded, except on one thing, which is aesthetics.
Yeah, we were going to talk about aesthetics. Right?
Because aesthetics is the way in which you relate primarily with your sensation. Aesthesis is the act of feeling in Greek. Aesthetics is not painting nice pictures. Aesthetics is the way in which you relate with sensations directly. And then it's at that stage that you decide aesthetically, which form of worlding you adopt, which metaphysical machine you set in motion. Infinite machines are possible. You decide on the basis of your inclination, your aesthetic inclination, your intuition.
Just let's pause over this word aesthetics, because it sounds very, I always think it sounds like something one might do at university. You know, you might do ethics and aesthetics, and it sounds a bit posh. But you were telling me that I didn't seem to have an allergy to posh. But you were sort of saying it comes from the Greek, which is to do with perception, basically. It's not a kind of, you know, it's not, because it's all got mixed up in the West with things, you know, apparently the word aesthetics comes from when they were translating Kant from German into English, and they used it from then, and then they used, then it all got mixed up with art for art's sake and Walter Pater's ideas of aesthetics and so on. But you're saying something else, aren't you?
Well, let's take the hint of the world.
Right. That's good, yeah.
Whatever its origin, let's take the hint. Let's hermeneutically use the word in a better way than as a definition. And it hints to the... directly, it hints to the sensations. This is very interesting because it's at that level that you decide how you're going to direct everything else. And you, as Max Stirner said, you rest... I don't know why I'm mentioning so much tonight. I don't usually think about it that much. But you rest your case on nothing, except your particular preferences, instinctive preference. I see a migrant boat sinking in the Channel of Sicily. I feel something. Maybe the person next to me feels something entirely different aesthetically. You see what I mean?
Yeah, I know. Yeah.
Certainly they do. Certainly we have different aesthetic intuitions because clearly somebody must like this. You know? So I can imagine that there are different perspectives. They're all metaphysically legitimate. So I will never go and say that one is true and one is false, but they have consequences.
Yes, indeed.
Okay, this is the important thing to keep in mind. Then you can decide whether you endorse them or not.
It's interesting because my own teacher says that all true values are aesthetic. That's how you judge the truth. It's for instance how you judge if someone's telling the truth, isn't it? It's really an aesthetic judgment where you feel like this. You don't ever know that is the truth, but it's an aesthetic judgment or somewhat,
which strangely puts truth together with happiness.
Right.
Strange, no? I mean, it puts them in the same realm. The fundamental conditions of truth, the truth values, which are the metaphysics, fundamental ideas about reality, come from the same place of preference, so of happiness. I don't know more than this about this. I'm just noticing it now.
So listen, we need to start to draw this to a close. But I wanted to come back to that, that day again. That I keep sort of going on about one of the days that you thought you were going to die. At that time you were an atheist. Now you like when we met the other day at South Bank, you were saying, actually, no, I'm a Catholic. So talk me through that. How did you get to be a Catholic? And then I was thinking, would the Pope agree?
First of all, I never talk about this in public.
Don't you?
Ever.
Sorry, turn the camera off.
Never. No, it's really the first time. It never enters the conversation.
But it's important, isn't it? Why?
Yeah, it's important. Okay, at the beginning I was talking about the fact that there are two different types of ecclesia. Ecclesia being the word for synagogue, community. What is the term in Sanskrit? Here.
Oh yeah, sorry.
It's the same.
I did actually know that weirdly. But
okay, it's the same thing. And there are two. The one that is primarily a community of people, and one is primarily a community of the visible and the invisible. To simplify, okay? Catholicism as a history primarily as a community of people. Okay, as a political community that legiferates about a number of things: how to use your body, who you can love, and so on and so forth. Okay. I am an anarchist before being a Catholic in terms of my politics. Okay, so absolutely none of that is part of in the way in which I understand myself as a Catholic at all. Okay. Including the secular authority of the Pope on anything.
Right, yeah, so we can draw the Pope out of this discussion.
No, exactly. No, exactly. So, or secular authorities in general, including the Pope.
Right, yeah.
Okay. Now, in terms of the other side, the community between the visible and the invisible, there was a metaphor that I think came originally from you through Manlio to me, okay? From you to somebody else.
To somebody else, yeah.
That imagine you are in a deserted field and there's 5 wells and there's water at the bottom of each one. But if you dip your bucket a little bit in each, you will remain thirsty. So you have to choose one, dip it all the way down. There's water at the end of all of them. So that's the interesting part. There was this thinker called Fridtjof Schuon, this Swiss Sufi, who used to call it the transcendent unity of religions. I know this is a point of contention, I know. But the way I look at it, I think that there is a transcendent unity of religion in the sense that the ultimate point, the ultimate vanishing point, the hub at the center of the wheel, in which every religion is a spike, is the same. Then each spike is physically actually different, okay? And it would be wrong to say that this one and this one are the same. They're not the same. But the ultimate vanishing point in which the spike disappears and becomes the hub is the same hub. Okay? For me, Catholicism is the path. The path because you can have an intuition of the ineffable beyond words, of what Ibn Arabi calls the absolute. When Al-Hallaj says, I am Al-Haq, I am the absolute, okay? It refers to this thing, which is not something external from you. It's the principle of existence and the principle of awareness together. The knower and the known, and so on, okay? You can have an intuition of this, rarely. If you're very lucky, more than once. If you're very lucky once. If you're very, very lucky, more than once. But most of your life, you don't.
That's right.
And I think that's also the point of the London Buddhist Center. No?
Yeah.
You have to create a path.
Yes, exactly.
A technique of remembering.
Yes.
That brings it back, maybe not physically as an intuition, it's difficult, but as an awareness of that, an awareness of what you've forgotten.
There has to be a sort of discipline, from my perspective. There has to be some cost, a discipline, a path.
And you got to choose one.
Yeah.
I could have chosen another one, but I'm a sucker for images. And Catholicism, I think, has a. No, I'm joking. That's not the reason why. But it's. No, we were talking about it the other day about the Trinity and so on. But I find some of the linguistic, visual, and conceptual elements of Christianity in general and Catholicism in particular very remarkable. And they work well for me.
And do you think that's to do with, being brought up in Italy?
Of course, most likely, yes.
Quite Christian, isn't it? Quite Catholic. Is it to do with that, or is it to do? Because in Buddhism we have a similar thing where people sometimes really struggle with being able to relate to Buddhist imagery because they're culturally, for many people, sort of alien. Yeah. So is it to do with a sort of cultural rhyming that comes from your back?
Yeah.
But I'm thinking that, but I also remember that your parents were both communists, so presumably they weren't encouraging you to go to church.
I never went, but we had some awkward conversations later in life. But for example, I was just recently in Arles, France, for a job, and in the cathedral there has this wonderful door at the top that depicts various aspects of the life of Christ, and there is one about the killing of the innocents. And in the killing of the innocents, you see all these babies being chopped off by people with chainmail. Full chainmail, of the particular style of the 13th century. The evolution of armors, as the full-breasted thing comes later, the chainmail is specific of the 13th, 12th century. That scene, they were dressing everyone in their own clothes, but it was set 1,200 years before. In medieval art, it's typical, or in Renaissance and so on.
Yeah, of course.
It looks very kitsch through the eyes of the age. But if we do it today, it's kitsch. If you take, some people dressed like an American military in very similar lands when Jesus was, okay? Yeah. That image looks very kitsch because it doesn't go together with the idea that it is a symbol.
Yes.
That is a kitsch literal expression and it's bad taste. But from the worlding perspective of symbology, the fact of dressing everyone like a medieval person setting the scene 1,000 years before works.
Yes,
so I can see that, this is another aspect, you can syncretically transform the past and the present in images distant lands and close by. We were looking at this statue in particular, for example, how he has some traits that are typical of the Greek tradition of images.
Yes, that's right. Yeah.
Like in the Gandharan region in Afghanistan, where Greek imagery and Buddhist religion merged to create a mixed visual style. The statue you have in the other room is one of the Gandharan arts now. Because you have to make a symbol relevant to the experience.
So that's to do, isn't it, to do with the power of symbol itself, to use that simple language as to hint at something, that, to be something material in this material world in which we understand things through language, but it hints at something beyond that world. That's what a symbol is.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's very similar to some limit words that we have also. When you say to somebody, "I love you," if you don't say it in a kind of like drunken state and whatever, but if you actually mean it, I think from the other side there is a recognition, hopefully, that the term itself does not contain the thing, and it's an invitation to something entirely inexpressible. That's why in mystical poetry you often have love as a typical metaphor. In Persian mystical poetry, it's all about love. The love of the little bird and the rose. The rose has a thorn, the little bird gets closer, pierces itself. So yeah, symbols are fingers pointing to the moon. And you're not entirely sure to which moon, okay? And you're not even sure that if there is a moon, maybe it's just the act of looking away, which is the real point of a symbol. There isn't actually a place, God, so to say, is not a thing that the symbol points to, but there is an attitude of the mind looking in that direction towards the unknown, which we can also say is the philosophical attitude also.
It's a great place to finish. Thank you very much.